So I'm Jeff Parker, Director of the Master of Engineering Management Program and a faculty member here at Thayer. And this is a job talk today for our data analytics position and more broadly for building out the applied math capabilities here at Thayer and really more in cooperation with a lot of other departments on campus, in particular the Geisel School and the Computer Science Department and Tuck next door that have a lot of overlapping interests. So it's a really exciting time. So I'm really happy to welcome Jason Pacheco, who is doing a postdoc at the Center for Artificial Intelligence at MIT and has extensive background at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, which I thought was really cool. And if you have sort of read your Tom Clancy books, you'll think about all the signals and intelligence and sort of think about the data processing that goes into that. Jason has a background in computer science from Brown and prior to that from UMass Dartmouth. That's as much of your time as I want to take.
Yeah, thanks.
So.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out. So it is true, I have a background in signal processing at the Navy, but I can't tell you about any of that, so I'll tell you about something completely different. So my background is in statistical machine learning, and I'm going to touch on lots of different applications throughout this talk. I'm going to touch on applications in computer vision, in brain-computer interfaces, in structural biology, computational, or systems biology, but I'm not an expert in any of these fields. What I'm really concerned with and focusing on is the algorithmic development for reasoning in each of these problem domains. And so fundamentally, this is an algorithmic talk, but I am using applications to motivate each of the components. So one application I've worked a bit on that I'll use to motivate things is intracortical brain-computer interfaces. So here's a case where you have a person with full body paralysis, and the task here is to allow them to move a mouse cursor, shown in white, through a neural implant directly in the primary motor cortex. So you can see a sort of external connector on the head here, and random targets pop up on the screen, shown in red, and we don't know the locations of those targets, and the computational task is to decode the neural signals and figure out where to move the mouse cursor. And so that's one motivating problem, but there's lots of different problems of this flavor. And the way I like to think about these reasoning problems, as I call them, is as an interaction among different reasoning subtasks. So this diagram here sort of represents the way I like to think about these types of probabilistic reasoning problems. You have all of these, you have this flow through these different subtasks. So for example, if you think about the BCI application, you have some prior knowledge about the primary motor cortex and where the sensory neurons, what the layout of sensory neurons in the primary motor cortex is. You have some level of uncertainty based on the data you've observed where the intended cursor direction is. And then you have this information gathering procedure, which in this case is a small implant embedded directly into the motor cortex and is sensing neural spike activity. And you take the data that you've observed and do some computation. This is your inference step, and update your beliefs about what you think the intended motion of this thing is. And you do this loop for a while, and when you're reasonably certain, you go ahead and move the cursor. That's your task execution phase. And then, not to be forgotten, underlying this entire process is some notion of a representation. This is sort of your model. So here's the outline of the talk. I'm going to do a brief background to give everybody a quick refresher, if you're not, or if you're not already familiar, an explanation of probabilistic inference and an explanation of probabilistic graphical models, which is one particular representation that I'll lean on in this talk. In the middle, I'm going to talk about a family of algorithms for performing probabilistic inference in these types of applications where you have high-dimensional, continuous, nonlinear interactions, the types of properties that you see a lot in complicated scientific applications. And then the last component of the talk will be on information theoretic decision-making. How do you make decisions that maximally reduce your uncertainty or improve your belief about the state of nature? And then I'll finish up with a few future directions given time. So we'll start with the background here. And I'm going to focus here on this inference subtask. And to do that, I'm going to motivate it with some applications in computer vision. So in computer vision, fundamentally, you're trying to reason about scenes in images or video. And so the first step is we build a probability model because I'm doing statistical modeling. So you have some unknown quantity of interest. In this case, the task is human pose estimation. So your unknown quantity of interest is a representation of the human pose and shape in an image. And then your data, we'll call these unknowns X. And then your data we'll call Y. That's, in this case, just an image. And we build a joint probability model, which is a high-level view is that you have a prior distribution over your unknown variables, P of X, and then you have a likelihood about which expresses the probability of observing some data Y conditioned on a particular configuration of your unknown. So how likely is it that I saw this image conditioned on this being the pose of the human in the image? And then we do inference to compute a posterior belief, which represents our belief or our distribution about the unknown quantities given the data that we've observed. And we do this using Bayes' rule, which is just a ratio of your joint probability model over this somewhat complicated-looking integral. And really the key message here is that in order to do inference, we have to be able to do this integral, and that's what makes inference hard, because computing that integral often lacks a closed-form solution except for very simple models. But we can think about the posterior distribution as a fundamental representation for performing a particular task. So we don't necessarily want to just do inference for the sake of doing computation. We want to do inference to perform some task. So one such task would be to produce an estimate. So give me an estimate of what is a likely human figure in this image. One such estimate is a maximum a posteriori estimate, or MAP estimate for short. And it's simply defined as the maximizer of the posterior belief, or the posterior probability distribution. And in this case, the maximizer, if you have a good model, should correspond to the most probable human pose in the image. But in complex models, your posterior distribution is often multimodal. So you have these significant local modalities. And in this case, those local modalities, in many cases, those local modalities may correspond to interesting observation or interesting explanations in their own right. So here we have a probabilistic model of just a single human figure, and we've presented it an image with two humans. And so we would reasonably expect that there should be at least two modes in the posterior probability, and there may be some secondary mode that corresponds to another figure in the image. So this will come up later, and what we would like is some inference methodology that's robust to these multimodalities. But before we can actually do inference, we need a representation. And the representation that we typically use in machine learning are graphical models. So here's three different kinds of graphical models that often show up: Bayes network, factor graph, Markov random field. A lot of you may have heard about like deep neural networks. I think of deep neural networks as just another particular type of graphical model. And the reason we use, well, essentially these are all graphical representations of a joint probability model. In this case, the probability distribution over the random variables x1 to x5. And the reason we like to use these is it allows you to model complex global phenomenon with these simpler to specify local interactions. And so we're going to specifically look at pairwise Markov random fields. So pairwise Markov random field is simply a representation of a joint distribution that factorizes according to a product of a bunch of pairwise terms. And the model here shows in white each white node represents an unknown random variable, and a shaded node represents an observable random variable. And each interaction in the probability distribution, so for every factor involving two nodes xs and xt, there exists an edge in the graphical model coupling those two nodes. So you have a set of edges and vertices. And the real reason we use these in machine learning is because they allow for the development of efficient inference algorithms. And so that's why identifying a useful representation drives all of these decision-making tasks. And in particular, it drives our inference stage. And I'm going to show you exactly why that is here. So if we're doing map inference, we can look at that as just maximizing a joint distribution. Because of the distributive law of the maximum operator, we can push that through, and you end up with these sub-stages of lower dimensional maximization operations. And this essentially boils down to dynamic programming if you've seen it before, but you can visualize it as passing messages in this pairwise Markov random field. So for example, doing this maximization with respect to x4 produces a function of x2, and you can visualize that as passing a message from node 4 to node 2. And similarly, this maximization is a message from node 3 to node 2. So this is a one toy example, but this actually leads to a more general algorithm called max product belief propagation. And max product belief propagation can be applied in theory to any Markov random field by a simple update rule. In order to compute the message from node T to node S, I simply multiply all of the incoming messages to node T, shown here in blue, and then any terms involving nodes T and S, and I perform a maximization step with respect to XT, and the result is a function of XS. That's my message from node T to node S. When you apply this algorithm to specific graphical models, you end up with special cases that you might be familiar with. For example, when you apply it to a hidden Markov model, you get exactly the Viterbi decoder. Or in models of channel coding, you get decoders, well-known decoders for turbo codes and low-density parity check codes. And then there's also a very strong relationship to the Kalman filter, if you're familiar with that. So turning back to this BCI application, again, we have this patient. There's a sensor directly implanted into the motor cortex, and we're trying to decode neural signals. So how do we apply this graphical modeling methodology in that application? Well, we constructed this somewhat complicated-looking graphical model, the details of which are not important. What is important is it is modeling a time series, and time is progressing on the horizontal. The observable quantities here in Z are the measured neural spiking activity. And all of these white nodes, which are unknown, represent things like the intended direction of motion or the unknown location of the target on the screen. And because of this factorization, each of these quantities becomes sufficiently low dimensional that we can compute these belief propagation updates by discretization. So these are all continuous quantities. Let me just back up to here. I forgot to mention the important point I want to make on this slide is that while we have a rule for computing a message, we can't always do that computation for arbitrary models. So if X is high dimensional, continuous, or these functions involve nonlinear interactions, you can imagine that this is just a nonlinear optimization problem. So solving it for any single message is hard. So in this case, that's true. All of these things are continuous, but they tend to be they end up being sufficiently low dimensional because of this representation that we can discretize them and just do this message update through discrete optimization. And we've actually run this in clinical trials, several clinical trials, and outperformed the state of the art, which uses a Kalman filter, which assumes linear Gaussian dynamics, which clearly don't hold with discrete neural spiking activity. So that work was actually published in the advances of neural information processing systems a couple years ago. So I'm going to move on to the next section, and I'm going to introduce this family of algorithms for doing these belief propagation updates in continuous models where we can't do this discretization. And I'm going to return back to the problem of human pose estimation. So first we need to start with the model. I've already told you about graphical models, so let's just define a graphical model. We have a pairwise Markov random field where we have one node for each. We have one variable shown here by nodes representing each body part in the upper torso, and then we have an edge connecting physically adjacent parts. The data is an image in this case, and the unknown variable is the location, orientation, shape, and scale of each individual part. So we have our representation, and we want to do inference, but the problem is our representation is such that the latent quantities, the unknown quantities, are high dimensional, and we can't just do this discretization step. So for example, the part representing the torso, you have 2 degrees of position, a degree of orientation. We actually have several degrees of shape because we represent shape using a principal component analysis. So the representation is 10 dimensions. If you just allow 10 states per dimension, that's 10 million points to represent a single part. And then you have to start reasoning about interactions between parts. So clearly this approach doesn't scale well. So what we want is an approach, rather than, we could think of, instead of doing a regular discretization, we could do sort of a dynamic discretization. So what we actually want is an approach that applies to any pairwise Markov random field, which doesn't place any sort of tractability assumptions on the model components. We'd like it to be black box in the sense that it doesn't require any gradient information to do these maximizations. And we'd also like it to be robust to local optima in the sense that I introduced earlier on. And so that set of methods I developed is called particle max product. And there's 3 simple steps. So the first step is to sample a bunch of discrete hypotheses of your unknown random variables. We'll call these particles, from a set of proposal distributions. So there are really no restrictions on these proposal distributions. They can be problem specific, and they're just generating likely hypotheses of, in this case, possible heads or torsos or arms or whatever. And you add those to your current set of particles. So that's your augmentation step. And now, given that set of particles, the problem is a discrete problem. So you can perform the max product belief propagation update over that discretization. So there's no problem there. But now, we can't just keep growing this set of particles in an unbounded way, or we'll violate we'll run out of computation. So we have to have a step which discards bad hypotheses and retains good hypotheses. So you can start with a set of n particles, grow that set through augmentation to alpha n for some alpha larger than 1, and now you want to do this particle selection step and reduce back down to n particles, assuming n is the budget that we've decided we can deal with computationally. So we need this particle selection method. So one obvious idea, because we have a probability model, suppose I have a set of particles representing hypothesized head locations. I can evaluate the likelihood of each one of those, and I can just rank them and take the top n best, most likely head locations, and I can do this for every single particle. So this is like a very greedy approach you can call, so I call this top n particle max product, or D-PMP. The problem with this is that under random initializations, you get this degeneracy property where particles converge onto a single mode. So here's a synthetic image that shows 4 figures in the image. So they're actually spelling out ICML because I submitted this to the conference ICML. And they're, under each random initialization, you find a different mode. And that mode depends on the initialization. And the reason for that is it's fundamentally a continuous problem. So small perturbations of the same hypothesis have similar probability values. So when you rank them by probability and just keep the top n most probable particles, you would expect that they would all be I'm missing a slide in here. Oh, no, I'm not. You would expect that they would all be very similar. So our idea is to maintain some notion of diversity in the particles so that this doesn't happen. And the way we do this is I introduce this diverse particle selection step. And at a high level, it's basically a subset selection procedure. You start out with a whole bunch of particles shown here in blue. You solve an integer program, and the solution to that integer program gives a subset of particles shown here in red that have the property that they are diverse in some sense. And they're diverse in a way that the subset corresponds to distinct local modes of the probability surface. And so the way we formulate that integer program is we want to minimize the total distortion between max product messages computed on the full product set, the full particle set, and those computed on any subset, where the subset is controlled by this indicator vector z. So z is basically just a binary vector, which is 1 if a particle is included in the subset and 0 otherwise. And this is a classic subset selection problem, and so trivially you can show that this is an NP-hard problem. So we can't solve this exactly, but it turns out that you can show that this objective function has a property of submodularity. So what is submodularity in a nutshell? A set function f, which is a function over all possible subsets of some base set z, is submodular if it has this property of diminishing marginal gains. And what diminishing marginal gains is, suppose you have this base set z and you have concentric subsets x and y, where y is a subset of x, and you consider any element e that is in neither x or y. Diminishing marginal gain says you get a larger change in your set function value when you include the element to the smaller set y than if you include it to the larger set x. So in words, the way I like to describe this is you get a better bang for your buck by adding e to the smaller set y than you do by adding it into your larger set. And this is an important property because you can show, so I proved that this corresponds to maximizing a submodular function. And submodular maximization, there is a result that says submodular maximization you can do submodular maximization using a greedy algorithm and always be within 1 minus 1 over e, roughly 63% times the optimal value. So we can just add the best particle at each stage and will always be no worse than 63% of the optimal value. So we have basically a linear time algorithm for doing this. And if we apply it to the same problem, the final particles look like this. So you might look at that and say, well, they actually look a little messy. Well, the key property you're looking for is for each distinct mode in the probability surface, so in this case, for each distinct figure in the image, does there exist a reasonable joint configuration that explains it in the available particles? And the answer is yes, and we can actually show that. And we do more extensive results to show that, in fact, this does much better on average than other methods. But I'm not going to show you those. I'm going to explain this in a way that there's this notion of uncertainty quantification. And what I argue is that by having this diverse particle selection step, you're actually getting better estimates of your uncertainty in the posterior distribution. The earlier result, which just focuses on a single mode, loses all of the uncertainty associated with other modes. So reasoning about uncertainty and uncertainty quantification is very important. And when you apply this to real images, you actually see the same effects. So for example, here's a real image we apply this to, which again has multiple people in the image. And so indeed, you get groups of particles corresponding to distinct figures in the image. Even though our model doesn't explicitly model multiple figures, you're actually finding them. And when you pull out the most probable modes corresponding to each group of particles, they actually produce good estimates of each figure. And even when you have single people in the image, you see diversity on a more fine scale. So for example, the red estimate here is the map estimate. And it's hard to see with these lights, but actually the arm is a little foreshortened. And this is a modeling issue. So the most probable hypothesis under the model is actually wrong with respect to the true image. But the second and third most probable, shown here in green, actually correspond to the true hand location. So secondary and tertiary particles actually do capture significant explanations of the data. And then down here on the right is a precision recall curve over a much larger extended data set of all these images. This is the Buffy data set because it's frames from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which they apparently got rights to use. Here's the baseline method in blue called the flexible mixture of parts model. And you can see diverse particle max product. D-PMP has a much larger area under the precision recall curve. And then T-PMP has very high precision but low recall, again, because it's latching onto single modes and missing others. We can also do this applying the exact same inference methodology now to videos. And so basically the model is almost unchanged. The only difference is we add a motion prior, which couples motion between consecutive frames. But the inference is completely agnostic to this model, as long as it knows the factorization of the model. You give it a graphical model, and it will do inference. And now your data are clips of the TV show Friends. And here, in addition to the images, you're also getting these estimates of motion called optical flow. It's not really important what it is, but it's sufficient to say it's a statistic of some motion in the image. And we apply this to a full data set, and our baseline here is shown in magenta. This was the baseline of a previous paper. And when we look at the accuracy of predicting the elbow location, so we're focusing on the elbow location because all methods do a pretty good job of isolating torso and head, but the arms tend to move a lot and they're harder to capture. We get a uniformly higher accuracy with respect to the detection threshold, where the detection threshold is how many pixels away from the annotated location do we consider a true detection. So basically across the board we have an improvement. And when we also look at, so our method is in red here, when we also look at applying the previous single frame human pose estimation to the images, so not accounting for motion, you get this line here. So clearly we're exploiting the motion component of the model. And when you look at the final particles, you'll often see things like this, where top n particle max product will often lose track of an elbow like it does here. So for example, there's an appearance term in our model that says lower arms often look very skin-colored, but this guy happens to be sitting on a chair that has like a very skin-looking color to it. So at some point, this arm switches and it sort of sits there, and the other arm switches to this one right there. And if you look at the particles in that frame, you see that there are no particles on the true explanation of the hand here, whereas under D-PMP, not only do you have particles for the correct hand location, you also have particles for the hypothesis that it actually switched to the other arm. And the model prefers the correct configuration, so it's not actually switching here. I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, but the high-level notion here is I've applied the same inference methodology to some problems in structural biology, in particular protein structure prediction. And if you're familiar with it, you can do things like side chain prediction, and I'm also working on full tertiary protein structure prediction. So to tie this back in to this diagram of how I think about reasoning problems, and why representation is so coupled to inference, under each of these models you have very different representations. So your representation under the human pose estimation problem is each particle is a hypothesis of a body part location and scale and so on and so forth. In sidechain and protein structure prediction, you have very different representations relating to like amino acids. But once you specify a representation, this diverse particle max product inference takes care of the rest. It exploits that representation in a flexible way to, in the sense that it's completely agnostic to what the underlying model is. So most of this work is in these two publications in the International Conference of Machine Learning, but essentially to sum it up, what we showed is, we have this very general purpose algorithm that effectively performs inference for these high dimensional, continuous, nonlinear models in a fully black box manner where you can just specify the model externally and just provide an interface to the underlying inference and sort of push run and get results. So this notion of having like general purpose methods that perform reasoning tasks for complex models motivates a lot of my research, and you'll see it again here in this last section on the last sort of researchy section on information theoretic decision making. So here we're thinking about quantifying uncertainty in information gathering, and I'm going to motivate this part of the talk with this problem of gene regulatory network inference. So I'm not going to assume that anybody knows anything about gene regulatory networks. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know to follow this section. So really, genes fundamentally produce proteins when they're expressed. So a gene gets turned on, we call it an expression, and it generates some protein or sometimes an RNA. And it's a very complicated process that involves lots of biochemical signals, but to distill it down to its simplest form, we can think of the genome as having this causal relationship among genes where the expression of one gene can cause another gene to overexpress or underexpress or turn off or whatever. So genes will regulate other genes. But we can't directly observe these causal interactions. Instead, what we observe are the gene expressions themselves. So here's a visualization of a microarray of gene expression where each cell is a single gene, and the color of that cell is proportional to the expression level of that gene. So you might say, well, let's just measure a lot of gene expression levels and then start making guesses about the possible interactions that generate them. Well, from a network, if we just measure gene expressions a bunch of times, what we can compute is the correlation among different gene expressions. But correlation is not the same as causation. So given correlation among gene expressions, there are lots of different possible causal interactions that are consistent with that same correlation. So what we actually have to do to distinguish between the two is we have to perform active interventions. So in this case, one thing we can do is clamp a gene to a particular value, in particular 0. And this is something that's actually done in the lab called a gene knockout experiment. So they essentially apply synthetic proteins that bind to specific sites on the DNA that cause the gene to not be expressed. So we can pick a gene and say we want to turn this one off, and then we can observe the resulting expression level of the other genes. Okay, so now we have the basic setup of the problem. And if we think about it in terms of a statistical model, we have a belief or a distribution over our unknown quantity of interest, which is the interaction network. And then we have a set of interventions or actions that we can perform. Each action corresponds to performing a gene knockout experiment on a particular gene, and it produces a measurement. And when you integrate that measurement through inference, you get an updated posterior distribution. So every action is going to give you a different result, which is going to lead to a different posterior distribution. So we need some mechanism for deciding which is the best action or the best intervention to perform. And the way we do that is we choose the one that is going to most reduce our uncertainty about the underlying regulatory network. So basically, if you look at these posterior distributions, each one of them have different, this one is most concentrated. So basically, this last experiment would most reduce our uncertainty. After we did it in expectation, we'd be very certain about what the network actually is. So in order to do that, we need a measure of uncertainty, and the measure that we use is entropy. So entropy is defined as the expected negative log probability of a random variable, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but it's easier explained by example. Suppose you're flipping a coin. You can model a coin flip as the result of, or as a draw from a Bernoulli distribution, which is a distribution over 0 and 1. So a 0 corresponds to a tail traditionally, and 1 corresponds to a head. And that distribution is controlled by a parameter p, which controls the bias of the coin. So if p equals 0, then the coin always comes up tails, and if p equals 1, it always comes up heads. And if we look at the entropy as a function of this parameter p, we see that the entropy is maximum when p equals 0.5. This is precisely when the coin is fair, so it could go either way. So this is the sense in which entropy corresponds to uncertainty. But what we actually care about is reduction in uncertainty. We want to perform the experiment that most reduces our uncertainty. And to do that, we compute the mutual information. So the mutual information is the difference between the uncertainty, your initial uncertainty, h of x, and then your uncertainty about x conditioned on some external information, y. So you could say, this is how uncertain in the network configuration we start out with, and this is how uncertain we will be after doing some experiment. It's also a notion of how much information content y carries about x. Or you can also think of it as the measure of the dependence between x and y. So we're going to use this as a utility for performing these experiments or making these decisions. But the computational problem is that computing mutual information is basically as hard as doing inference. And I've already shown that doing inference can be very hard in these models. And so a standard technique for doing this is Monte Carlo estimation. So some of you may have seen Monte Carlo estimation. So basically you draw a whole bunch of samples from your model. So for each hypothesized action A, we have a model parameterized by A, and we draw a whole bunch of samples. And then we just estimate. We have this I hat of A, and it's just doing Monte Carlo integration over your set of samples. And then we can now plan based on maximizing these estimated mutual informations. We can do that, but now we have questions about to what extent is this estimator an accurate reflection of the true information content in any particular experiment. Is it a biased estimator? Is it consistent? All of these different statistical notions. It turns out it is a biased estimator, although it is asymptotically consistent. But doing this estimator, which is called an empirical mean, is sensitive to outliers. And so what we do instead, and I'm just going to sort of talk about this line of work at a fairly high level without going into details, is we use some results from robust statistics to define a robust M estimator that minimizes the impact of these outliers. And through properties of that estimator, we can prove that under some regimes, it actually has provably lower estimation error than the standard empirical mean estimator that I just showed you. We can also bound the probability of selecting the optimal action. So we can say with some probability, like with probability 1 minus 2 epsilon, you will choose the best possible intervention. And then a computational side note is that to make everything run a little bit more smoothly, we have a sequential importance sampling approach that reuses samples, so you're not doing posterior sampling quite as often. And I'm just going to show the results on this toy problem visually. So we start out with 0 interventions, and we have basically no information. So our estimated network is just a bunch of disconnected nodes. Here's the true network here. And this row will be our robust estimator, and this bottom row will be a non-robust estimator that uses the empirical mean. It was a recent publication in 2016 specifically for this application. So this is application specific, whereas ours is a general purpose method. I'm just motivating it with this application. So we choose our first intervention experiment and we perform the experiment, integrate the results, and produce our estimate. And this is our estimate. So basically, it's important to point out that these two methods don't necessarily choose the same experiment. They have the same set of experiments available to them, but they don't choose the same one at each stage because of the errors in the estimators. So our method is already learning something about the network, whereas the baseline method has learned nothing. And then after 5 interventions, again, different sequence of 5 interventions for each method, we're already getting pretty good estimates of the network, whereas they're essentially no better than we were after the first intervention. So to do proper statistics, we don't do this just one time. We do this many, many times over random instantiations of the network. And we look at the result of edge prediction. So basically the area under the receiver operator curve. So higher is better here. Versus the number of interventions. So 0 interventions up to 20 interventions. And our method, and we're showing here a median and then upper and lower quartiles over many successive trials. And what we find is that our robust estimator gets a lot more information in earlier stages. So you get a much better idea of the network with many fewer interventions than the non-robust estimator shown in red here. And then random guesses just shown in blue. And basically all of these methods are converging to the same thing. So if you do enough random trials, you're essentially, at least in this small case, you're going to converge to the same thing. But even though sample-based information theoretic planning can be very accurate, it can also be very slow. So it doesn't scale well because you have to do Markov chain Monte Carlo inference. So more recently, I've developed a method which I won't talk about at all, which is based on a variational lower bound on the mutual information. So basically maximizing a lower bound on the mutual information, which can be done very efficiently, and in some cases can be done even in closed form. So that's upcoming this year in the Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Statistics. So I've only shown one application here, but actually we've demonstrated this on a variety of applications. So this is a general purpose method. ICML 2018 and AI Stats 2019 are the primary references for this. And finally, I'm going to conclude with just some future directions, ideas I have going forward. And so in many applications, you have some primary quantity of interest. This is your unknowns. And you have some primary observable data. And you have a very detailed statistical model about how your unknown quantities relate to your primary observables. But you also have access to lots and lots of auxiliary information, which you know is related, which you know has some relationship to your unknowns, but it's not quite clear what that relationship is, or it's a very complex relationship that you don't want an accurate model of. So the question then is, can you start with a detailed model of your primary quantities of interest and observable data, and somehow integrate your auxiliary data in a way that's very lightweight, so it boosts model predictivity, but doesn't result in totally intractable, unusable models. So you can still perform inferences reasonably efficiently. And here's an example I've been looking at recently, which is predicting the electrification status in developing nations. So in developing countries, access to electricity initially starts out very hodgepodge. And what we want to get at is, for any particular region, what is the probability that somebody in this region has access to electricity? So that's shown here. And what we have a detailed model of are on-the-ground surveys, where people have gone out and actually surveyed and said, do you have access to electricity? We also have access to a lot of auxiliary information, which is like the location of specific transformers, the locations of buildings, or satellite imagery data, which is taken at night, and you can see lights. So where there are lights, there is probably electricity. And so the question is, can we integrate this auxiliary data into the model in a way that boosts it? So this is what I'm calling lightweight data fusion. The takeaway message on this slide is that for information theoretic planning, it's often the case that there's very little benefit in early stages and very little benefit in later stages. Like, you can do basically just as well with random guess early and late, and that's because early on you really don't have any information to make educated decisions, and later on you've done enough experiments that basically any method has good estimates. And so if you're in the regime where you have limited computational resources, you'd like to only do information theoretic decision making in this intermediate regime. So the question then is, can you identify when am I in that intermediate regime? And then if you could just do random guess, identify, okay, I'm entering a regime where doing more educated information theoretic decision making would be useful. You turn that on, and then you turn it back off when you get out. And then my last sort of future work thing, I didn't really talk about the protein structure prediction stuff, but I've done a bit of work in it, and the takeaway here is that proteins don't exist in thermodynamic equilibrium, that they take on multiple conformations depending on the function that they're going to perform. Some of them actually have like mechanical continually varying actions, like you have protein pumps that facilitate cell transport through the cell membrane. And so can we use some of these ideas from diverse inference to identify the multiple different configurations for protein structure? So in the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip this slide. I'm going to just say that all of the diverse particle max product stuff is available online, and it's black box. So if you just specify a model and a set of proposal distributions for this particle augmentation step, everything under this dashed green line is provided in a library, and you just sort of write the wrapper to interface with it in MATLAB code currently. There does exist a Python implementation, which I haven't released yet. And that's basically it. So here's my sort of the contributions I've discussed here with some relevant publications, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.